The red dust swirled around Joseph Begay's weathered boots as he stood alone on the mesa, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon. At 35, he had spent most of his adult life tending to his grandmother's sheep and maintaining the old ways on the Navajo reservation. The isolation never bothered him before, but lately, the silence felt different, heavier somehow. His grandmother, Maria Begay, had passed away 6 months ago, leaving him the keeper of traditions that seemed to fade more each day. The younger generation moved to the cities, chasing opportunities that the reservation couldn't offer. Joseph remained, not out of obligation, but because the land spoke to him in ways that concrete and steel never could. Every morning, he would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check the ancient prayer ties his grandmother had taught him to make. The routine gave his life structure, but it also highlighted how alone he truly was. His closest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and days would pass without seeing another human soul. The loneliness had become a constant companion, especially during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the canyons. Joseph often found himself talking to his grandmother's spirit, asking for guidance about his future. At his age, most men in his community had families, children carrying on their names and traditions. Joseph was different. He had always been the quiet one, the observer rather than the talker. In high school, while his friends dated and made plans to leave the reservation, he spent his time learning from the elders. He memorized songs that hadn't been sung in decades and learned to identify medicinal plants that most people had forgotten about. His deep connection to Navajo culture made him valuable to his community, but it also set him apart from potential romantic partners. Women his age wanted modern conveniences and steady paychecks. They wanted men who could navigate both worlds, traditional and contemporary. Joseph felt comfortable only in one. The sheep bleated softly as evening approached, reminding him to bring them into the shelter. As he guided them home, Joseph noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading to his property. Visitors were rare, and he couldn't imagine who might have business with him. Walking toward his modest house, he saw a figure sitting on his front porch. As he got closer, Joseph recognized Sarah Mitchell from the trading post in town. She occasionally bought his grandmother's jewelry and pottery, always treating him with respect and genuine interest in his work. Sarah stood as he approached, her long black hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her brown eyes, and Joseph felt his heart skip in a way that surprised him. He had always found her attractive, but never considered that someone like her might visit him at home. "Joseph," she said with a warm smile, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I brought back your grandmother's turquoise bracelet that I had repaired in town." He accepted the bracelet, noting how her fingers briefly touched his during the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he found himself studying her face more carefully than he ever had before. "Thank you for taking care of this," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "My grandmother would have appreciated your kindness." Sarah lingered on the porch, seeming reluctant to leave. "I also wanted to tell you that I'm engaged," she said quietly, her eyes not quite meeting his. "The wedding is next month." The words hit Joseph like a physical blow, though he tried not to show it. He had never seriously considered pursuing Sarah, but hearing about her engagement made him realize how much he had hoped, even if unconsciously, that someday circumstances might bring them together. "Congratulations," he managed to say, though the word felt bitter in his mouth. "He's a lucky man." Sarah's expression grew troubled. "His name is David Chen. He's a lawyer in Albuquerque. Good family, stable job, everything my parents always wanted for me." She paused, looking out at the vast landscape that surrounded Joseph's home. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to choose a different path." Joseph felt something stir inside him, a mixture of hope and desperation that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he found himself wanting to fight for something beyond tradition and duty. The storm clouds were moving closer now, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Sarah hurried to her car, calling back over the wind, "Take care of yourself, Joseph. This place needs people like you." As her taillights disappeared down the dusty road, Joseph stood in the increasing rain, feeling as though his entire world had shifted. The loneliness that had been his constant companion now felt unbearable, and for the first time, he began to contemplate what it might mean to truly fight for what he wanted. The storm was coming, in more ways than one, and Joseph Begay would have to decide whether he was brave enough to face it. The red dust swirled around Joseph Begay's weathered boots as he stood alone on the mesa, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon. At 35, he had spent most of his adult life tending to his grandmother's sheep and maintaining the old ways on the Navajo reservation. The isolation never bothered him before, but lately, the silence felt different, heavier somehow. His grandmother, Maria Begay, had passed away 6 months ago, leaving him the keeper of traditions that seemed to fade more each day. The younger generation moved to the cities, chasing opportunities that the reservation couldn't offer. Joseph remained, not out of obligation, but because the land spoke to him in ways that concrete and steel never could. Every morning, he would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check the ancient prayer ties his grandmother had taught him to make. The routine gave his life structure, but it also highlighted how alone he truly was. His closest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and days would pass without seeing another human soul. The loneliness had become a constant companion, especially during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the canyons. Joseph often found himself talking to his grandmother's spirit, asking for guidance about his future. At his age, most men in his community had families, children carrying on their names and traditions. Joseph was different. He had always been the quiet one, the observer rather than the talker. In high school, while his friends dated and made plans to leave the reservation, he spent his time learning from the elders. He memorized songs that hadn't been sung in decades and learned to identify medicinal plants that most people had forgotten about. His deep connection to Navajo culture made him valuable to his community, but it also set him apart from potential romantic partners. Women his age wanted modern conveniences and steady paychecks. They wanted men who could navigate both worlds, traditional and contemporary. Joseph felt comfortable only in one. The sheep bleated softly as evening approached, reminding him to bring them into the shelter. As he guided them home, Joseph noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading to his property. Visitors were rare, and he couldn't imagine who might have business with him. Walking toward his modest house, he saw a figure sitting on his front porch. As he got closer, Joseph recognized Sarah Mitchell from the trading post in town. She occasionally bought his grandmother's jewelry and pottery, always treating him with respect and genuine interest in his work. Sarah stood as he approached, her long black hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her brown eyes, and Joseph felt his heart skip in a way that surprised him. He had always found her attractive but never considered that someone like her might visit him at home. "Joseph," she said with a warm smile, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I brought back your grandmother's turquoise bracelet that I had repaired in town." He accepted the bracelet, noting how her fingers briefly touched his during the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he found himself studying her face more carefully than he ever had before. "Thank you for taking care of this," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "My grandmother would have appreciated your kindness." Sarah lingered on the porch, seeming reluctant to leave. "I also wanted to tell you that I'm engaged," she said quietly, her eyes not quite meeting his. "The wedding is next month." The words hit Joseph like a physical blow, though he tried not to show it. He had never seriously considered pursuing Sarah, but hearing about her engagement made him realize how much he had hoped, even if unconsciously, that someday circumstances might bring them together. "Congratulations," he managed to say, though the word felt bitter in his mouth. "He's a lucky man." Sarah's expression grew troubled. "His name is David Chen. He's a lawyer in Albuquerque. Good family, stable job, everything my parents always wanted for me." She paused, looking out at the vast landscape that surrounded Joseph's home. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to choose a different path." Joseph felt something stir inside him, a mixture of hope and desperation that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he found himself wanting to fight for something beyond tradition and duty. The storm clouds were moving closer now, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Sarah hurried to her car, calling back over the wind, "Take care of yourself, Joseph. This place needs people like you." As her taillights disappeared down the dusty road, Joseph stood in the increasing rain, feeling as though his entire world had shifted. The loneliness that had been his constant companion now felt unbearable, and for the first time, he began to contemplate what it might mean to truly fight for what he wanted. The storm was coming, in more ways than one, and Joseph Begay would have to decide whether he was brave enough to face it. 3 days passed before Joseph saw Sarah again. He had driven into town twice hoping to catch her at the trading post, but Tom Yazzie informed him that she was busy with wedding preparations. The old man's knowing look suggested he understood more about Joseph's visits than he let on. On Friday morning, Joseph was repairing a section of fence when he heard a car engine struggling in the distance. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the unmistakable ping of an overheating radiator. He looked up to see Sarah's blue sedan limping up the dirt road toward his property, steam billowing from under the hood. The car shuddered to a stop near his gate, and Sarah got out looking frustrated and worried. She wore jeans and a white cotton blouse, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even flustered, she was beautiful. "Joseph, thank goodness you're here," she called out, walking toward him. "My car just died and my phone has no signal out here. I was on my way to photograph some petroglyphs for a project when this happened." Joseph set down his tools and approached the smoking vehicle. "Let me take a look," he said, popping the hood. The problem was immediately obvious. A burst radiator hose had left the engine dry and overheated. "It's not good," he said, closing the hood. "You'll need a tow truck and probably a new radiator. The engine might be damaged too." Sarah's face fell. "David is going to be furious. We have the final cake tasting this afternoon, and the rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night." She looked around at the vast landscape surrounding them. "I can't even call anyone from here." Joseph hesitated, then made an offer that surprised them both. "You could use my phone, but the nearest tow truck is probably 2 hours away. If you want, I could drive you back to town." "I couldn't ask you to do that," Sarah said, but her relief was evident. "It's no trouble. But first, where were you trying to go?" "Those petroglyphs?" Sarah's eyes lit up despite her car troubles. "Yes, there's a site about 5 miles north of here. I'm working on a research project about traditional Navajo symbols and their meanings. My professor said there are some rare glyphs in this area that haven't been photographed in decades." Joseph felt something click into place. "I know those petroglyphs. My grandmother showed them to me when I was young. Some of them tell the story of the twin heroes, others show the migration patterns our ancestors followed." "You could read them?" Sarah asked, her professional interest overriding her car troubles. "Some of them. My grandmother taught me to understand the old symbol systems before she died." Joseph paused, then made another spontaneous decision. "If you have time, I could show you the site. We could go in my truck." Sarah glanced at her disabled car, then at Joseph. "The cake tasting isn't until 3 o'clock. I suppose I have time." 20 minutes later, they were bouncing along a barely visible trail in Joseph's pickup truck, heading deeper into the canyon country. Sarah gripped the door handle as they navigating the rough terrain, but her excitement grew as they approached the petroglyph site. "There," Joseph said, pointing to a smooth rock face protected by an overhang. "My grandmother called this the storytelling wall." They parked and walked to the ancient rock art. Sarah pulled out her camera and notebook, but for several minutes she simply stared at the intricate symbols carved into the stone centuries ago. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Some of these symbols aren't in any of the academic texts I've studied." Joseph moved closer to the wall, running his fingers just above the carved surfaces. "This section tells about the emergence from the lower worlds," he said, pointing to a series of connected spirals. "And this one shows the sacred mountains that mark our traditional territory." For the next hour, Joseph translated the petroglyphs while Sarah photographed and took notes. She asked intelligent questions that showed her deep respect for Navajo culture, and Joseph found himself sharing knowledge that he had never told anyone outside his immediate family. "Your grandmother must have been an amazing teacher," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "Most of this oral tradition is being lost." "She was worried about that," Joseph replied. "She made me promise to find ways to keep the old stories alive." As they drove back toward Joseph's house, Sarah grew quiet. Finally, she said, "I envy you sometimes." "Envy me?" Joseph was genuinely surprised. "You know exactly who you are and where you belong. You have this deep connection to your heritage, to this land. Most of us spend our whole lives searching for that kind of certainty." Joseph pulled the truck over and turned to face her. "I haven't felt certain about anything lately, especially not about who I am or what I want." Their eyes met, and Joseph saw something in Sarah's expression that made his heart race. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Sarah looked away first. "We should get back. I need to call David and explain about the car." The spell broken, they drove the rest of the way in silence. At Joseph's house, Sarah used his phone to call her fiancé. Joseph could hear David's raised voice through the receiver, could see Sarah's shoulders tense as she explained the situation. "He's sending a tow truck," she said when she hung up. "He'll pick me up here in an hour." They sat on Joseph's porch waiting, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the mesa. Sarah seemed lost in thought, occasionally glancing at the photos she had taken. "Joseph," she said suddenly, "what you shared with me today, those stories, that knowledge, it's precious. You shouldn't keep it locked away out here." "What do you mean?" "You could teach. There are programs at the university, cultural preservation projects, museums that would love to work with someone who has your knowledge." Joseph considered this. "I never thought about leaving this place. You wouldn't have to leave permanently, but you could share what you know with the world. Your grandmother's teachings could live on through others." When David arrived, his expensive car looking out of place on the dusty road, his greeting to Sarah was curt and businesslike. He barely acknowledged Joseph's presence as he hurried Sarah toward his vehicle. "We've missed the cake tasting," David said as they drove away. "I had to reschedule everything." Joseph watched them disappear down the road, feeling more alone than ever. But something had changed during those hours with Sarah. For the first time, he could envision a life beyond the boundaries of his solitary existence. The question was whether he had the courage to pursue it, and whether pursuing it might mean losing the only woman who had ever made him want to try. The rehearsal dinner was held at the finest restaurant in Flagstaff, an hour's drive from the reservation. Joseph had no business being there, no invitation, no connection to the celebration. Yet he found himself driving toward the city as the sun set, pulled by a force he couldn't name or resist. He parked across the street from the restaurant and sat in his truck, feeling foolish but unable to leave. Through the large windows, he could see the wedding party gathered around long tables, decorated with white flowers and candles. Sarah sat at the head table beside David, wearing an elegant black dress that made her look like she belonged in that world of polished surfaces and expensive wine. Joseph was about to leave when he saw Sarah step outside onto the restaurant's patio, a glass of champagne in her hand. She stood alone, looking up at the stars that were barely visible through the city's light pollution. Without thinking, Joseph got out of his truck and crossed the street. Sarah turned as he approached, her surprise evident. "Joseph, what are you doing here?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I was driving through town and saw the lights." It was a weak explanation, but it was all he had. Sarah glanced back at the restaurant where laughter and conversation spilled through the open doors. "You shouldn't be here. I know, but I needed to see you. Joseph, please don't make this harder than it already is." "Is it hard?" he asked, stepping closer. "Getting married shouldn't be hard." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand. This isn't just about me. David's family, my family, everyone is so excited. My mother has been planning this wedding since I was 16. What about what you want?" "I want to do the right thing," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The right thing for who?" Before Sarah could answer, David appeared in the doorway. His face darkened when he saw Joseph. "Sarah, what's going on out here?" David walked over, positioning himself between Joseph and his fiancée. "Who is this man?" "This is Joseph Begay," Sarah said quietly. "He helped me when my car broke down earlier this week." David looked Joseph up and down, taking in his worn jeans, simple shirt, and weathered boots. "I see. Well, thank you for helping, Sarah, but this is a private family event." "I was just leaving," Joseph said, but his eyes remained on Sarah. "Good," David said curtly. "Sarah, we need to get back inside. Your father is about to give his speech." As Sarah moved toward the door, Joseph called out, "Sarah, wait." Both she and David turned back. "I meant what I said about teaching. The university program I mentioned. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez in the anthropology department has been looking for someone exactly like you. I gave her your name." David's expression grew cold. "Excuse me? You gave someone my fiancé's name without permission?" "It's fine, David," Sarah said quickly. "It was just about the research project I've been working on." "What research project?" David demanded. "You never mentioned any research project." Joseph realized he had inadvertently created tension between them, but he pressed on. "Sarah has a real gift for understanding traditional cultural symbols. Dr. Rodriguez is starting a comprehensive documentation project of southwestern tribal petroglyphs. It's a 3-year grant from the National Science Foundation. Sarah isn't interested in some dead-end academic project, David said dismissively. She has other plans. What plans? Sarah asked, her voice sharp. David looked surprised by her tone. Well, we've talked about this. After the honeymoon, you'll move to Albuquerque. There are plenty of good jobs there. Maybe something in museum administration or event planning. Museum administration, Sarah repeated slowly. Event planning. Stable jobs with good benefits, David emphasized. Not chasing around the desert looking at old cave paintings. Joseph saw something change in Sarah's expression. The polite mask she had been wearing slipped, revealing the passionate, intelligent woman he had glimpsed at the petroglyph site. They're not cave paintings, Sarah said quietly. They're historical records, spiritual texts, maps of ancient migrations. They're the preserved voices of people who lived here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. David looked bewildered by her intensity. Okay, sure, they're historically interesting, but that doesn't mean you need to make a career out of it. Why not? Sarah asked. Why shouldn't I make a career out of something I care about? Because it's not practical, Sarah. We have a future to build together. A real life with a real income and real security. Joseph watched the exchange, seeing clearly how David viewed Sarah's passions as hobbies to be indulged temporarily, then set aside for more serious pursuits. It was exactly the opposite of what Sarah needed. Someone who understood that her interests weren't just interests. They were callings. I should go, Joseph said, recognizing that his presence was only making things worse for Sarah. As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, Joseph, wait. This Dr. Rodriguez, when does she need an answer? The project starts in 6 weeks, Joseph replied. But Sarah, you don't have to. 6 weeks, she repeated, looking directly at David. That's after our honeymoon. David's face flushed. Sarah, we are not discussing your career at our rehearsal dinner. This is neither the time nor the place. And then when is the time, David? We're getting married tomorrow. And I just discovered that you've been making plans for my life without consulting me. The voices from inside the restaurant grew louder, and Joseph realized people were looking out at them. Sarah's mother appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. Sarah, honey, is everything all right? Your father is ready to start his toast. Sarah looked at her mother, then at David, then at Joseph. For a moment, Joseph thought she might say something that would change everything. Instead, she took a deep breath and smoothed her dress. Everything's fine, Mom. Just getting some air. She turned to Joseph. Thank you for letting me know about the opportunity. I'll consider it. Sarah, David said warningly. I said I'll consider it. David, that's what adults do. They consider their options. With that, Sarah walked past both men and back into the restaurant, leaving David and Joseph alone on the patio. I don't know what game you think you're playing, David said in a low, angry voice, but stay away from my fiancée. Sarah is confused right now, but tomorrow she'll be my wife, and this little fantasy of yours will be over. Joseph met David's gaze steadily. She deserves better than someone who thinks her dreams are fantasies. And you think you can give her better? You live in a shack in the middle of nowhere herding sheep. What kind of life is that for a woman like Sarah? I don't know, Joseph said honestly. But I'd never ask her to give up who she is to fit into my idea of who she should be. David's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, Sarah reappeared. David, they're waiting for us, she said, her voice carefully controlled. She didn't look at Joseph as she added, Goodbye, Joseph. Thank you again for your help this week. As they walked back into the restaurant together, Joseph noticed that David possessively placed his hand on Sarah's back, a gesture that looked more like ownership than affection. Joseph returned to his truck, knowing he had probably made things worse rather than better, but as he drove home through the desert night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The question was whether Sarah would find the courage to act on what she really wanted, or whether she would choose the safety of a life that would slowly suffocate her spirit. Tomorrow was the wedding, and Joseph realized with crystal clarity that he could not simply let Sarah marry David without telling her how he felt. The risk of rejection was enormous, but the risk of staying silent was even greater. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains look close enough to touch. Joseph had not slept. He sat on his grandmother's porch watching the sunrise and trying to find the courage for what he knew he had to do. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock at a historic chapel in Sedona, followed by a reception at a luxury resort. Joseph had learned these details from Tom Yazzie, who had heard them from his niece, who worked at the florist shop that had provided the wedding flowers. By noon, Joseph had made his decision. He showered, put on his best clothes, dark jeans, a pressed white shirt, and the turquoise bolo tie his grandmother had given him for his high school graduation, and began the drive to Sedona. The chapel sat nestled among red rock formations, its stone walls glowing in the afternoon sun. Cars were already arriving when Joseph parked at the edge of the lot, far enough away to avoid attention, but close enough to see the wedding party preparations. Sarah's family bustled around the chapel entrance, directing photographers and adjusting flowers. Joseph recognized her mother from the rehearsal dinner, elegant in a navy blue dress and matching hat. Her father, distinguished in his dark suit, was speaking with the minister. At 3:30, a white limousine arrived. Joseph's breath caught as Sarah emerged, radiant in a flowing white dress that seemed to capture and reflect the desert light. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate style, decorated with small white flowers. She looked like a vision, beautiful and ethereal, but Joseph thought he saw something troubled in her expression. The wedding party formed a procession, and Joseph watched from his truck as they entered the chapel. The last to arrive was David, handsome in his black tuxedo, accompanied by his groomsmen and family members who clearly came from wealth and privilege. Joseph sat in his truck for 20 minutes, listening to the faint sound of organ music drifting from the chapel. He knew that any moment now, the minister would ask if anyone objected to the union. It was a formality in most weddings, but Joseph realized it might be his only chance. His hands shook as he got out of the truck and walked toward the chapel. The back doors were slightly open, and he could hear the minister's voice carrying over the small congregation. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join David Chen and Sarah Mitchell in holy matrimony." Joseph slipped inside and stood at the very back, partially hidden behind a stone pillar. The chapel was intimate, filled with perhaps 60 guests. Sarah stood at the altar facing David, her back to Joseph, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the minister continued, "but reverently, advisedly, and in the fear of God." Joseph watched as David took Sarah's hands, saw the practiced smile on the groom's face, but when Sarah briefly turned her head, Joseph glimpsed something in her profile that looked like resignation rather than joy. "Do you, David Chen, take Sarah Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer, for better and for worse, till death do you part?" "I do," David said clearly, his voice carrying confidence and satisfaction. "Do you, Sarah Mitchell, take David Chen to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer, for better and for worse, till death do you part?" Sarah hesitated. It was barely perceptible, just a half-second pause, but Joseph felt it like a physical blow. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that several guests leaned forward to hear. "I do. If any person can show just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." This was the moment. Joseph felt his grandmother's presence as surely as if she were standing beside him. He thought of Sarah's eyes when she looked at the petroglyphs, the passion in her voice when she talked about preserving cultural heritage, the sadness he had seen when she mentioned her engagement. Joseph stepped forward from behind the pillar. "I object." The words rang out in the small chapel like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him, faces registering shock, confusion, and in some cases outrage. Sarah spun around, her face pale beneath her veil. "Sir, you need to leave immediately," the minister said, his voice stern but controlled. Joseph walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes locked on Sarah's. "Sarah, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I couldn't let you do this without telling you the truth." David stepped forward angrily. "Security. Get this man out of here." "There is no security," the minister said quietly. "This is a house of God." Joseph reached the front of the chapel and stopped a few feet from Sarah. "You don't have to marry him. There are other choices, other paths. You don't have to settle for a safe life if it means giving up your dreams." Sarah's mother stood up from the front pew. "Young man, this is completely inappropriate. Sarah is getting married." "Mom, it's okay," Sarah said, never taking her eyes off Joseph. Her voice was steadier now. "Let him speak." Joseph felt the weight of 60 pairs of eyes on him, but he focused only on Sarah. I know I have no right to be here. I know I'm not what anyone would choose for you. I don't have money or education or any of the things that David can give you." "Damn right you don't," David interjected. Joseph ignored him. "But I see you, Sarah. I see who you really are, not who everyone thinks you should be. I've seen your passion for the old stories, your respect for the traditions that most people have forgotten. You light up when you talk about preserving cultural heritage, and you should be doing that work, not settling for event planning or museum administration." Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet. "I'm not asking you to marry me instead," Joseph continued. "I'm asking you to marry yourself first. To choose the life that makes you come alive, not the life that makes everyone else comfortable." David stepped between them. "Enough, Sarah, tell him to leave." "Tell him you're marrying me because you love me." Sarah looked at David, then at Joseph, then at the faces of her family and friends. Her father had stood up from his seat, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. Her mother looked mortified. "Sarah," her mother pleaded, "don't let this stranger ruin your wedding day." "He's not a stranger," Sarah said quietly. "His name is Joseph Begay, and he's taught me more about who I really am in 1 week than I've learned about myself in years." The chapel fell silent, except for the sound of someone crying. One of the bridesmaids, Joseph realized. Sarah turned to face the congregation. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm sorry to all of you for letting this go this far. David, you're a good man, but you're not the right man for me. I can't marry you." David's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, humiliation. "Sarah, you're having cold feet. This happens to brides. We can work through this." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This isn't cold feet. This is clarity." She reached up and removed her veil, shaking out her dark hair. The white flowers scattered to the chapel floor like fallen snow. "I've been trying to be the person everyone wanted me to be for so long that I forgot who I actually am," Sarah said, looking directly at her parents. "Mom, Dad, I love you, and I know you want what's best for me. But what's best for me isn't what you think it is." Her father stepped forward. "Sarah, honey, you're upset. Let's talk about this privately." "No, Dad. I've been talking privately my whole life. And look where it got me. Standing at an altar about to marry someone I don't love. About to give up everything that matters to me." David's composure finally cracked. "You don't love me?" "We've been together for 2 years." Sarah's expression softened with genuine regret. "I care about you, David. But I was in love with the idea of you, with the security you represented, with the approval you brought from my family. That's not fair to either of us." The chapel erupted in whispered conversations as family members and guests tried to process what was happening. Several people had pulled out their phones to record the drama. Joseph took a step closer to Sarah. "What will you do?" "I don't know," Sarah said, and for the first time since he had entered the chapel, she smiled. "For the first time in years, I have no idea what comes next, and it feels terrifying and wonderful." David made one last desperate attempt. "Sarah, if this is about that job thing, we can discuss it. Maybe you could do some part-time consulting or something." "It's not about the job, David. It's about who I am when I'm with you versus who I am when I'm not. When I'm with you, I feel like I'm wearing a costume. When I'm alone, or when I'm..." She glanced at Joseph. "When I'm with people who see the real me, I feel like myself." Sarah's mother had been crying quietly, but now she stood up. "Sarah, if you walk out of this chapel, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. David is a good man from a good family. How many chances like this do you think you'll get?" "I don't know, Mom, but I'd rather be alone and true to myself than married and living a lie." The minister, who had been standing quietly throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Perhaps everyone should take some time to think about this. Emotions are running high." "No," Sarah said decisively. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, maybe months. I just wasn't brave enough to admit it until now." "Go, but it's how they need to go." Sarah began walking down the aisle toward the chapel doors. As she passed Joseph, she paused. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know this wasn't easy for you." "What you're doing is harder," Joseph replied. "It takes more courage to stop a mistake than it does to point one out." Sarah reached the chapel doors and turned back one final time. "David, I hope someday you'll understand. You deserve someone who loves you completely, not someone who's settling for safety." With that, she walked out of the chapel, leaving behind her wedding, her fiancé, and the life everyone had planned for her. Joseph followed her outside where Sarah stood in the afternoon sun, still in her wedding dress but no longer a bride. She looked liberated and lost at the same time. "Where will you go?" Joseph asked. "I have no idea," Sarah said, laughing despite the tears streaming down her face. "I just ended my engagement, disappointed my entire family, and humiliated myself in front of 60 people. But you know what? I feel more alive right now than I have in months." Joseph took off his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. "Dr. Rodriguez's offer is still open. The project doesn't start for 6 weeks. 6 weeks to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone else wants me to be," Sarah mused. "That might be just enough time." Inside the chapel, the sound of raised voices indicated that the aftermath of Sarah's decision was just beginning. But outside in the Red Rock Cathedral of Sedona, two people stood together at the beginning of something neither could predict or control. And for the first time in either of their lives, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than fear. 2 weeks after the wedding that never was, Sarah sat cross-legged on Joseph's porch, watching him repair a broken saddle while she transcribed her notes from their latest petroglyph expedition. She had been staying in town at a small motel, but spent most of her days at Joseph's place, learning about traditional Navajo practices and helping him document the stories his grandmother had taught him. The aftermath of her decision had been brutal. Her parents weren't speaking to her. David's family had threatened to sue for the cost of the wedding, and half the town seemed to have an opinion about her behavior. But none of that mattered when she sat here in the desert silence, feeling more connected to herself than she had in years. "The spiral symbol appears in 3 different locations at the Red Canyon site," Sarah said, looking up from her notebook. "But each time it's paired with different secondary symbols. What do you think that means?" Joseph set down his leather working tools and considered her question. "My grandmother always said the spirals represent journeys, but not all journeys are the same. Some are inward journeys of the spirit, others are outward journeys through physical space. And some are journeys through time," Sarah added, making notes. "The migration stories, the seasonal cycles, the passage from one life stage to another." Joseph smiled. Over the past 2 weeks, their intellectual partnership had deepened into something rich and collaborative. Sarah's academic training complemented his traditional knowledge in ways that surprised them both. "Dr. Rodriguez called again yesterday," Sarah said. "She wants to meet with us next week to discuss the documentation project." "Us?" Joseph looked up from his work. "I may have mentioned that I had found an invaluable cultural consultant who could help ensure the project's authenticity and cultural sensitivity." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of involvement with the university." "Why not?" "Because once you start that project, you'll be traveling to research sites across the Southwest. You'll be working with other academics, other experts. You'll realize there's a whole world of opportunities out there that don't involve sitting on a remote mesa with a sheep herder." Sarah set down her notebook and studied Joseph's face. "Is that what you think? That I'm here because I don't have other options? I think you're here because you're between lives. But eventually you'll figure out what your new life looks like. And I don't know if there will be room in it for this." He gestured at the vast landscape around them. Before Sarah could respond, they heard a car approaching. Joseph's expression grew tense as he recognized David's silver sedan coming up the dirt road. "Sarah, we need to talk," David called out as he got out of his car. He looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks." Sarah stood up slowly. "David, what are you doing here?" "I came to bring you to your senses," David said, walking toward the porch. "This whole thing has gone far enough. People are talking, Sarah. Your parents are worried sick. You're throwing your life away for what? Some romantic fantasy about living in the desert?" Joseph rose from his chair, his jaw tight. "Sarah can make her own decisions. Can she?" David turned his attention to Joseph. "Or are you taking advantage of a woman who was confused and emotional? Because that's what this looks like to everyone else." "David, stop," Sarah said firmly. "Nobody is taking advantage of anyone." "Really?" "Because it seems awfully convenient that this guy shows up just before our wedding, fills your head with ideas about some dream job, and now suddenly you're playing house with him in the middle of nowhere." "I'm not playing house with anyone," Sarah snapped. "I'm staying in town and I'm working on a legitimate research project." David pulled out his phone and showed Sarah the screen. "Look at this." Look what people are saying about you. Sarah glanced at the social media posts David was showing her, photos from the wedding, speculation about her relationship with Joseph, gossip about her mental state. Her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. I don't care what people are saying, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Your mother does. Your father does. They're humiliated, Sarah. You embarrassed them in front of their entire social circle. Joseph watched Sarah's expression change as the weight of social disapproval settled on her. He could see her confidence wavering, could see the doubt creeping in. Maybe we should talk privately, David said, sensing his advantage. Without an audience. No, Sarah said quickly. Whatever you want to say, you can say it here. David looked at Joseph with undisguised hatred. Fine, Sarah, I'm offering you one last chance to fix this mess. The story we're telling people is that you had a panic attack, brought on by wedding stress. It's embarrassing, but people understand that brides sometimes get overwhelmed. That's not what happened, Sarah said. It doesn't matter what actually happened. What matters is finding a way forward that doesn't destroy your reputation and your relationships with your family. David's voice grew softer, more persuasive. We could have a small ceremony, just immediate family. We could make this right. Sarah looked at David, then at Joseph, then at the desert landscape that had become her sanctuary. Joseph could see the internal battle playing out across her face. And if I don't? Sarah asked quietly. Then you're on your own, David said bluntly. Your parents won't support this delusion anymore. Your friends think you've lost your mind, and when this fantasy falls apart, don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces. The threat hung in the air like gathering storm clouds. Joseph felt helpless, knowing that anything he said would only reinforce David's argument that Sarah was being manipulated. I need time to think, Sarah said finally. How much time? David pressed. Because I can't wait forever, Sarah. I have a life to live too. Give me until tomorrow, David nodded curtly. Tomorrow then. But Sarah, think carefully about what you're giving up, and what you're giving it up for. He looked pointedly at Joseph's modest house, his old truck, the isolation of their surroundings. After David left, Sarah and Joseph sat in uncomfortable silence. The peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon had been shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of consequences and social pressure. He's not entirely wrong, Sarah said finally. Joseph felt his heart sink. About what? About the cost of what I'm doing. My parents really are humiliated. I really have burned a lot of bridges. And I really don't know what I'm doing with my life. Sarah, no, let me finish. These past 2 weeks have been wonderful, but they've also been a kind of hiding. I can't stay in that motel forever. I can't spend every day out here pretending that the rest of the world doesn't exist. Joseph nodded slowly. So what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe David is offering me a way back to a life that makes sense. A life with structure and security and family approval. A life that makes you miserable. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Maybe I was wrong to think I deserved more than that. Joseph stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the mesa where his grandmother was buried. He could almost hear her voice on the wind reminding him that sometimes love meant letting go. If you marry David, he said without turning around, I won't interfere again. But Sarah, don't do it because you're afraid of disappointing people. Do it because it's what you actually want. When he turned back, Sarah was crying, not the dramatic tears of 2 weeks ago, but the quiet tears of someone facing an impossible choice. What if what I want doesn't matter? She whispered. What if wanting something isn't enough? Joseph sat down beside her and took her hand. Then you'll figure out a way to make it enough. But first you have to decide what you actually want, not what's easiest or safest or most acceptable to everyone else. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah Mitchell sat between two futures, knowing that tomorrow she would have to choose one or the other, and that either choice would cost her something precious. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in her motel room until dawn, staring out the window at the desert landscape that had become both her refuge and her battleground. By the time the sun rose, she had made her decision. At 9 o'clock, she called David. I'm not coming back, she said without preamble when he answered. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, you're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. What about your parents? What about your future? My parents will eventually understand or they won't, but I can't live my life to make them comfortable. And as for my future, I'm finally ready to create one that's actually mine. After she hung up, Sarah drove out to Joseph's place one last time. She found him in the sheep pen, checking on a ewe that was about to give birth. "I called David," she said without preamble. Joseph looked up from the sheep, his expression carefully neutral. "And?" I told him no. "I'm not going back to that life." Joseph straightened slowly but didn't move toward her. "What will you do?" "I'm going to take Dr. Rodriguez's job offer. I'm going to document petroglyphs and oral histories and spend the next 3 years learning everything I can about Southwestern indigenous cultures." "That's good," Joseph said quietly. "You'll be brilliant at it." Sarah studied his face, noting the distance in his manner. "Joseph, are you having second thoughts about all this?" "Not second thoughts. Just realistic ones." Joseph leaned against the fence post. "Sarah, you've made a brave choice, but you've also made a hard one. The work you'll be doing will take you all over the Southwest. You'll be collaborating with professors and researchers and tribal leaders. You'll be building a career, a reputation, a new life. Yes. And I'll still be here, tending sheep and maintaining traditions in isolation. Our worlds will intersect sometimes, but they won't merge." Sarah felt her heart sink. "Are you saying you don't want to try?" "I'm saying I want what's best for you, even if it's not what's best for me. Don't I get to decide what's best for me?" Sarah walked closer to him. "Joseph, these past 2 weeks have shown me something I didn't know about myself. When I'm with you, when I'm learning about the old stories and the traditional ways, I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do. That's not something I want to walk away from. The academic work will give you that feeling too. Some of it, but not all of it." Sarah reached for his hand. "Joseph, I'm not asking you to leave your life behind and follow me around the Southwest. And I'm not asking you to let me stay here and pretend the outside world doesn't exist. I'm asking if we can find a way to build something together that honors both of our needs." Joseph looked at their joined hands. "What does that look like?" "I don't know yet. Maybe I spend part of my time traveling for research and part of my time here, working with you to document your grandmother's stories. Maybe you come with me sometimes to sites where your knowledge would be valuable. Maybe we figure it out as we go. That's not much of a plan. No, it's not. But it's honest. And it's ours." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, watching the pregnant ewe pace restlessly in the pen. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits sometimes send people into our lives to teach us about courage. She said courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act in spite of fear." "What are you afraid of?" Sarah asked softly. "I'm afraid that you'll outgrow this place, that you'll outgrow me, that the world you're entering will show you possibilities I can't even imagine, and you'll realize what you're settling for by being with me." Sarah turned to face him fully. "And I'm afraid that I'll never be enough for someone like you. That my academic knowledge can't compare to the deep cultural wisdom you carry. That I'm just another outsider trying to study something I'll never truly understand." They looked at each other, both acknowledging the genuine risks they faced. "So what do we do?" Joseph asked. "We trust each other. And we trust that what we're building together is strong enough to survive the challenges." Joseph smiled for the first time that morning. "That still sounds like more hope than plan. Maybe hope is enough to start with." Before Joseph could respond, the ewe in the pen let out a low bleat. They both turned to see that she had gone into labor. For the next hour, they worked together to help bring new life into the world. Sarah held the ewe steady while Joseph assisted with the birth, their earlier conversation suspended in the face of immediate, practical need. When the lamb finally arrived, healthy and bleating indignantly at the world, Sarah and Joseph sat back against the fence, exhausted but exhilarated. "Look at him," Sarah said, watching the newborn struggle to its feet. "He has no idea what he's gotten himself into, but he's determined to figure it out." Joseph laughed. "Sounds familiar." 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in Dr. Rodriguez's office at the university, signing the contract that would launch her new career. The project was everything she had hoped, a comprehensive, 3-year study of petroglyphs sites across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, with generous funding for travel, documentation, and collaboration with tribal cultural experts. "We're particularly excited about your consultant, Mr. Begay," Dr. Rodriguez said. "His knowledge of traditional interpretation methods will be invaluable for ensuring our documentation is culturally accurate." Sarah smiled. Joseph brings a perspective that most academics don't have access to. His grandmother was one of the last traditional storytellers in her community. And you're comfortable with the travel requirements? Some of these sites are quite remote. I'm comfortable with remote, Sarah said, thinking of Joseph's mesa and the peace she had found there. That evening, Sarah drove back to Joseph's place to find him sitting on the porch, with his laptop, a recent purchase that still looked foreign in his weathered hands. Learning to use email, he explained sheepishly as she sat down beside him. Dr. Rodriguez says we'll need to stay in communication when you're traveling to other sites. And I figured it was time I learned to navigate both worlds, not just one. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, watching the sun set over the desert landscape that had become her second home. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering, but they no longer looked threatening. They looked like possibility. Joseph, yeah? Thank you for teaching me that it's okay to choose the storm over the shelter, as long as you're brave enough to face what comes next. Joseph wrapped his arm around her. Thank you for teaching me that courage isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you choose every day, sometimes every moment. As the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the desert clean and bringing the promise of new growth, Sarah Mitchell and Joseph Begay sat together on the threshold between tradition and change, between solitude and partnership, between the lives they had known and the life they were brave enough to build together. The storm had come just as Joseph had predicted. But instead of seeking shelter from it, they had chosen to dance in the rain,